Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with myself, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Before I joined Friends of Europe, I was at NATO, and for many of those years, I served as the NATO spokesman, which means that on a daily basis, I had to deal with the international media. The journalists often gave me a hard time. But that was fair enough because it's the job of the press to hold governments to account and to demand and expect reliable and honest information. But during those years, I also came to have a healthier respect for the press and the role that they play in society and of course in informing us about what is going on in the world. And therefore I was very saddened when last Tuesday I learned, like all of us, of the death of Arman Soldin, the video editor and video coordinator of Agence France Presse, the French news agency, who was killed in Ukraine by Russian shelling. He was only 32 years old, and he indeed is the 12th journalist, according to my statistics, to have died in Ukraine over the last year. Everybody has praised his bravery and his professionalism, but it reminds me that the job of a journalist is not becoming any easier or any safer. According to the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, an NGO based in New York, 2,197 journalists and media workers have been killed in various conflicts between 1992 and 2023. Some of them are famous names, people that I knew personally and worked with. For example, Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal journalist who was assassinated in Pakistan in 2002, or Kurt Schulk, the famous correspondent of the Reuters news agency in Bosnia in the 90s, but who died in Sierra Leone in an ambush in 2012. Others are names which are not familiar to either me or you, journalists from the Cameroons, from Pakistan, from India, from Kenya, who have been either assaulted or killed. And in many cases, for example, the 20 odd so journalists who have died in various shootouts between Palestinians and Israelis over the years. None of the perpetrators have ever been brought to justice or held to account. But it's not simply an issue of the death of journalists. It's also the fact that many countries now detain them and imprison them on jumped up charges. The most recent famous case is that of Ivan Geskovich, a Wall Street Journal reporter detained in Russia. Last week, Raman Pratovevich, a journalist imprisoned for 8 years in Belarus, or journalists who were expelled from a country like, for example, Sarah Rainsford, the BBC correspondent in Moscow 2 years ago. It reminds us how much we depend on journalists being able to do their jobs. They're the eyes and ears that tell the story, particularly from the ground up, from the human angle. They break through the spin, the propaganda, the fake news and the disinformation to interpret what is really happening and help us to make sense of it all. They hold, as I said, governments to account. They expose corruption, malfeasance, and incompetence, and they make governments, of course, more transparent and more willing to engage. And finally, they shake us out of our complacency, our comfort zones. We often want to turn a blind eye to the conflicts of the world, to the suffering of our fellow human beings, and the media make it impossible for us to do that and remind us of our common humanity and our common responsibility. So the freedom of the press is fundamental to any democratic form of existence or international society. So what to do? Well, I think 4 things are key here. Number one, we all have to keep the spotlight on abuses of the freedom of the press, not allow journalists to be detained in silence or in clandestinity, but continue to lobby for their causes and for their eventual release. Make it difficult for governments to abuse the freedom of the press. Secondly, we need to make sure that when the European Union, the United States, democratic countries sign trade agreements or international agreements with other countries, provisions on the respect of press freedom, mechanisms to supervise this, to hold our signatories to account, are built in from the very outset. It won't necessarily stop abuses, but at least there will be a mechanism to shine a spotlight on those abuses. The third thing we need to do is that the EU needs to, of course, uphold the values of the press and freedom of the press if it's going to preach those values beyond its borders. Now, you might say, well, that's not a problem, is it? Because the EU is a zone of democracy and peace. Well, yes, but there are issues. For example, in recent years, a journalist in EU countries such as Malta or Slovakia have been assassinated for pursuing corruption cases. In Poland and in Hungary and elsewhere, freedom of information has been denied to the media, and restrictions have been put on press reporting. The EU, to its credit, is now tackling some of these issues. For example, introducing a Journalist Safety Act, also a European Media Freedom Act, and something called anti-slaps legislation. What's that? Well, slaps is something which is used to introduce sort of vexatious restrictions on press freedom, to muzzle the press, prevent journalists from operating. For example, exaggerated privacy rules or exaggerated libel rules. And the EU, fortunately, is now also introducing an anti-slaps legislation to prevent those kind of exaggerations being used by individuals to deny the press the right to do their job. Finally, fourthly, the press also has to take its responsibility too. If the press breaks its own rules, then confidence in journalists and in their reporting is undermined. I mean, here in the UK, in recent times, we've had major scandals about wiretapping, phone hacking by the media of individuals' iPhones to get salacious stories. We've had journalists dressing up as fake sheikhs, again to extract embarrassing information from celebrities. The New York Times has had a big issue with a journalist who reported fake information deliberately. Boris Johnson, a former British Prime Minister, also a former journalist, he was fired by the Times in Brussels some years ago for making up fake quotations. He famously said afterwards that he never let the facts get in the way of a good story. But no, the whole point of media, of an objective media, is that the facts are the story everywhere and always. And then just last week, we had a German weekly magazine fire its editor after an interview with Michael Schumacher appeared, which was entirely generated by artificial intelligence. No real interview ever took place. So it's important that the guardians also police themselves if they are to have our trust when they wish to be the guardians of the public interest. Just a couple of kilometers away from where I live here in London, the BBC has its headquarters, and there's a large plaque on the wall as you go in at the main entrance. It quotes George Orwell, the famous British writer, who said, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." All of us have to make sure that we put pressure on governments to ensure that the media are always there to tell us precisely what we do not want to hear. Thank you for watching and listening today. All best to everybody, and I look forward to engaging with you in the very near future. Bye for now.